Welcome back to the second video from our tutorial series on writing unit and integration tests for React and Redux applications. In the last video, I gave you an introduction to this course, and I also showed you how to configure the application that we're going to be working with. Now, in this video, I'm going to be showing you how to test your React components. If you haven't seen our previous videos or want to check out more from this series, then there is going to be a direct link in the description of this video. We have a playlist available on our YouTube channel, SimpleTut, and we're going to be posting all the videos from this series on this playlist. Now, of course, at the point of this recording, this is only the second video, but of course, as we go through the series recording more videos, they will all be added here. Now, as you can see, this is going to be the application that we'll build. So as you can see at the top, we have our logo, our header section that contains a logo. This is probably going to be a functional component. We're going to have other components that we're going to need to build. So for example, for this header section, we'll probably create that as a component. We have a button here. So when we click on this button, it's going to trigger an asynchronous request to go out and fetch some data from an external API. And once we fetch that data, we're then going to render out posts on the page. Now, I just want to remind you that there is an official GitHub repository for this project, and I'm going to be pushing all the code from this series to this repository. So if at any point you want to look at the code that I'm writing, or maybe you just want to clone the project and examine the code on your own time, then feel free to visit this repository. You can find that by visiting our official GitHub page at github.com/simpletut and clicking through into the repository by finding testing React Redux with Jest and Enzyme. But there will be a direct link in the description of this video. So we are finally ready to start writing some code. So let's go ahead and get started. To do that, I'm going to open up my terminal. Again, I'm using iTerm. That just has some cool features that terminal doesn't have. Again, if you're working with Windows, then you're going to be working with CMD. Also, if you followed the last video, then you will have either cloned the project that we've created from the repository, or you already have the application set up somewhere on your machine. We just need to run that. So I'm just going to go into that folder within my terminal. So CD, I'm just going to open this up and drag my project folder into the terminal. That gives me the path. I can click on return, and as you can see here, I'm now within that folder, that directory within my terminal window. So if I just use the list command, you can see these are all the folders and files that I have within my applications folder. Now, the most important one here is, of course, the package.json file that has the different scripts that I need to run my application, to run my tests. So again, I'm also going to just use the following command, which is yarn start, and that's going to launch my application. Now, before we go any further, I'm just going to come back to my terminal window, and I'm also going to use a cool feature, part of iTerm, which is for me to hold down the command D, and it's just going to pop up another window that I can use to write some commands. Of course, on the left side here, I'm running my application, so I can't run any commands. So it's just useful for me to be able to write them right over here within the same window. But I do need to go into the correct directory within this terminal as well. So I'm just going to come over here, and again, I'm just going to drag that in just so that I navigate into that folder within my terminal window. We've now launched our application. As you can see, it's running in the background. Now, in the last video, we just created the basic configuration for our app. So we put in some placeholder text here for test, just showing us that the application is working and running in the background. Now, before we actually get started, I just want to come back over to our terminal. And if I run in the following command, which is git status, you'll see that we're currently working on the master branch. Now, this isn't really best practice for any project, so I'm going to create a feature branch. That's going to be what we eventually commit and merge with master at the end. So let's go ahead and create that. So it's just going to be git checkout, and I'm going to call this testing components. And as you can see there, once I click return, we've switched to a new branch called testing components. So let's just clear that down. You can do another git status to be sure, but as you can see, we're currently on the branch testing components. So I'm just going to use my shell command to launch my application in my text editor. I've installed that command, so if you haven't, you may just want to drag that into the editor, your application folder into the editor by just dragging it, or alternatively, if you're using a different text editor, then open it up your application in that. Now we are finally ready to start writing some code, and the first thing that I'm going to do is head over to our mockup so we can figure out the first component that we need to build. Now looking at our layout, our mockup here, I can tell the very first thing we need to do is build our header, and I can also tell that this is going to be a very simple component. We're not going to need any lifecycle methods, so I'm going to build this as a functional component. Now what this means is it's not going to be a class, which means we can't use anything like a lifecycle method, so it's just going to be a function that we export. Now if we actually head over to our application, you're going to notice again we don't have any components yet, so I'm going to create a components folder, and inside here we're going to build our header. Now the first thing I want to flag here is that this tutorial, this specific tutorial that we're doing, is all about testing components. And although I want to adopt a TDD approach, I want to write our tests first. This is more industry standard, where we write our tests before we write the code for our component. And we want to do that because traditionally we want to see our tests fail before we see them pass. This is how we know for sure that our tests are working correctly. The problem is that I'm a little cautious that if I was to do that, then some of the things that I do might not make sense, because this is the first time that you're going to be seeing the code, and this is also our first component. So I'm going to make other components in this tutorial where I do a TDD approach, where we write our tests first. But in this first example, I'm going to write the component first so that I can show you a better example of how the tests are working when it comes to writing those tests. And that's really because we're going to be creating some utility functions. These are functions that we export to a dedicated file so we can share that code across other files and other tests. So I'm going to be writing our actual component first, and once I've done that, I'm going to come back and write the test, but in future I'm going to actually write tests first. So let's go ahead and do that. So again, this is a simple component. It's pretty much just going to contain a logo. It's a functional component. Let's go. So inside of my new components folder, I'm going to create a header folder for our header component. And inside of this, I'm going to have pretty much just an index.js file. Again, this is a functional component, so let's just import React from React. And then we need to create a const for our header. This is going to equal a function where we return some JSX, which for this example is going to be a header. And we just need to export that here. So export default header. And let's just put in some placeholder text here. Let's just have header, and let's head over to our app.js, and at the top of this file let's import our new header. So import header from component/header, and then down here let's actually import that. So it's going to say header. Okay, so as you can see, we've successfully rendered out our functional component on the page. However, before we go any further, I want to be able to apply some pretty basic styling to our application just to make it look a little bit prettier. And to do that, I want to actually use SCSS. This is a CSS preprocessor that just makes our life a little bit easier. Now, to do that with Create React App, we actually need to install another dependency. Otherwise, we won't be able to import SCSS files. So to do that, I'm just going to come back over to my terminal window. First of all, I'm going to end the actual application running. And over here, I'm just going to run another install, which is yarn add node Sass. This is the name of the dependency that we need to install. So let's go ahead and install that dependency. That should be pretty quick. And once we've installed that, we can restart our application. So I'm just going to say yarn start. And of course, over here, you'll see that our application should just boot up. And also, if we come down to package.json, we'll have a new dependency for node Sass. That's very important. Great. So now we have that installed, we can just write some basic styling for our components. The first thing that I'm going to do is actually come over to app.js, and I want to create a new style for this, a new style sheet for this file. So I'm just going to say app.scss, and I'm going to import that into the app.js file. So I'm just going to say import, and I'm going to import app.scss. And because we have that dependency, that's going to work. And I just want to override some basic native styling from the browser. So I want to remove the margin, and I want to remove the padding, which is default. And actually also I want to set a background color for this application, which is a light gray. So I'm just going to come away from that now and come back over to our header component. And inside of this header directory, I want to create a styles.scss file. And inside of our headers index.js, I'm going to import that style sheet. So I'm just going to import styles.scss. And I can just now apply some styling here. But of course, we want to build up the code for our header component. So I need a wrapper. So I'm just going to say wrap. And then I want another div for the logo itself. And then of course we need to actually import the logo and render it on the component. So I'm going to import logo from. Now something I haven't mentioned here is that separate to the tutorial, inside of my assets folder, I've included a logo, which is a logo.png file. So you can actually go ahead, get your own logo and include it in your project, and we're going to import it here. So let's go ahead and do that. It's going to come outside of the directory into assets, graphics, and then it's called logo.png. I can then include that within the components JSX, so image, and then src, logo. Need some alt text. I'm going to hard code that as logo. And there you go. You can kind of see that we now have our header on the page. That's our logo. So I'm just going to make this look a little bit better. I'm just going to apply some really basic styling. So we have our header here. I'm going to set this as display block. Give it a width of 100%, margin 0 auto, padding maybe 10 pixels either way. Then we're going to target our wrapper component. This is again is going to be display block. We're going to give it a width of 100%. We're going to center it, but we're going to give it a max width of, let's say, let's say 980. So as you can see, we've kind of got that nicely centered on the page. But now we need to target our logo. And I'm actually going to set this as well to display block. But I'm going to set this as, give it a width of about, I think 250 pixels. I'm also going to make this position absolute to the left, 10 pixels, because we have a 10 pixel margin. It means on the wrapper here, I'm going to have that as a relative, position relative, and top 50%. And then I'm going to do a transform and translate y minus 50%. So we're going to need to apply some fullbacks here for WebKit and Moz. And let's come back over here. Before we do, actually, let's target that image. Make sure that's display block with a width of 100% and margin. We want to apply a margin to this of 0. Let's come back over here. Okay, so this is getting cut off. That's definitely not what we want. That would probably be because of the height. I'm going to hard code a height here of about 100 pixels, or maybe less, maybe like 70. What does that do? Let's just see what's going on. Let's inspect this. Okay, so this is interesting. I'm guessing that the wrapper is collapsed. The parent's got a fixed height, so that just needs to be like that. Cool. I'm thinking this needs to be a lot smaller. Yeah, that looks about right. Yeah, 100 pixels, maybe a little bit more, maybe like 200 pixels, 120. And we can drop this down maybe 50 pixels. That looks good. Yeah, that's perfect. So we want a height of 50 pixels and 120. So over here, height of 50, and we'll make this 120 pixels. Oh, and we need to make sure that the wrapper has a height of 100%. And that looks good. But I also want to make this, I want to give the header overall a background color. Gonna make this sort of a dark color. I think that looks good. Cool, so we have just created our first component, and it's definitely looking a little bit better, right? So cool, I'm happy with that. And again, apologies if this kind of tutorial's gone off and we've looked at styling and things like that, but it's kind of part of the process. I really want to give you guys like a project that we go through and actually build something, and I think it's going to be more effective in the long run. But we're actually ready to actually write our tests, which is really exciting. So let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so we're now ready to start writing our first tests. But before we do, I think this is a good place for us to actually do an initial commit. So I'm going to come back over to our terminal window. I'll just expand this to make it a little bit easier to see. I'm going to do a git status. And you're going to see that we've changed a few things. We've obviously modified package.json. We added a new dependency. We changed a few files. And also we have created some new files as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do a git add. And I'm going to add everything. If we clear that down, do another git status. We've added everything. Now I'm going to do a git reset head because it's bad practice to commit this yarn log file. So I'm going to remove that from the files I've added to be committed. And I'm then going to commit that. So I'm just going to do a commit here, initial commit of my components without tests. Clear that down, do another git status, and as you can see here, the only file that we do not have committed is this yarn log file. At this point, we've built our first component, which is our header component, and we've also applied some default styling to our application. This not only makes it a bit prettier, but it also makes it a little bit easier for us to work with. Now at this point, we're actually ready to write our first tests. The test that we want to write is that we want to check that the component renders successfully without errors, and we also want to check that it contains a logo. Now, as we're using Create React App, if I come over to our package.json file and we look at our scripts object, you're going to find that we already have a predefined test script. We can run that over in our terminal window by running yarn run test. Now within my header component, I'm going to create a new file called spec.js. Spec.js is considered to be a test file. So if I actually come over to our terminal window, you're going to see that this file is immediately found and is considered to have failing tests. Now this is one file type, but there is one other. So we can also create a header.test.js file, and that will also be found and considered to be failing. Now you may be curious as to why this is considered to fail when we don't even have any code inside of them. Well, the reason is your test files must contain at least one passing test in order to be considered to pass. Otherwise, it will fail. The other thing is that although here we actually have header.test.js, we can prefix this with anything. Our file just has to end with .test.js to be considered a test file. Now I am going to be working with the spec.js file, so I'm going to delete that file. I can also flag here that you can use any project architecture that makes sense to you. It just makes sense to me that we're going to have our test files in our component folders. Now let's actually go ahead and write our first test. So to do that, I'm just going to have to import React. So I'm going to import React from React. We also need to destructure something from Enzyme, so I'm going to import from Enzyme, and I'm going to destructure off shallow. And we also need to import the component we want to test itself. So we want to import the header component, so I'm going to import that from the index file. We're in the same directory as the index file, so I'll just import index. And we're finally now ready to write our first tests. So to do that, we can use two methods. The first is we can create a test method. We can also use a it method. They're both pretty much the same. I'm going to be using the it method. The first thing we have to do is pass a string. So I'm going to pass the following string that describes the test I'm writing. So I'm going to say that it should render without errors. Then we need to pass a function, and I'm going to save that. Now this is a test in theory, and that is actually enough to make our test pass, even though we're not actually testing anything. So we actually need to make our tests fail in order for them to actually be considered a failing test. So to do that, we're going to expect something. So I'm going to use an expect method, and we can really expect anything. So we could expect 1 to be 1, and that is going to actually pass. But if I was to, for example, expect 1 to be 3 and save that, you're going to see that this fails. Now, in this example, although we can see the actual test file, our test files could become quite large, could contain a large number of tests. So really, this isn't really enough for us to really easily be able to figure out exactly, what test inside of this file is failing. So I like to wrap this in a describe function. So I can really describe the test. So I'm just going to say header component, and then I'm going to pass a function to this, and I'm going to then paste my test inside here. And again, now when my test fails, I see header component and it should render without errors. I want to flag here that I can actually have a nested describe function here. I'm just going to say it is nested. Pass another function, put my test inside of that, and when this fails, I now see header component nested, and it should render without errors, and then I see my test. But even though in this example we don't need this, I just wanted to show you that you can actually have nested describe functions. But this is actually pretty good, right? So the only problem here is that we're not actually testing our component at all. So what we really need to do here is actually do a shallow render of our component. So to do that, I'm going to create a constant. So I'm going to say const. I'm going to create a component constant that is going to equal a shallow render of our header component. So I literally just pass in my header component here. And then I want to actually check for something. So I'm going to come back over to my index file. This is my header component here. And I'm going to add a class to my header here. So I'm going to add this as a class here. I'm going to say header component. And as I said, I'm kind of preempting, but I also want to check for my logo, that my logo renders. So I'm also going to add a class name to my image tag here. I'm just going to say logo img. And I'm going to come back over to my test file because I want to check for this class in that is rendered. So to do that, I'm going to create another constant called wrapper. It's going to equal. And we basically want to check for that. So I'm going to use my component shallow render, and I'm going to do a .find, and we need to tell it what we're looking for. So I'm going to say that we're looking for this class, and then I'm going to use that expect method here. I'm going to pass it my wrapper. I'm going to check the length here, and that should be 1 because there's only 1 on the page. So now if I actually come back here, you're going to see that my test is now passing. Now if you actually want to see what this shallow render is doing, we can actually do a console log here, and I'm going to do component.debug. And when I actually do that, you're going to be able to see what the shallow render is actually doing. So you can see that this first step where we're just doing a shallow render here, this is actually the code that's outputted. It's rendering the component. So you can see here that here's our class name and here's our image. So over here, we're then grabbing that shallow render and we're searching for this class. We're searching for a div with this header component class. And then, of course, we're just expecting that that should return 1. So if there was, for example, if I was to copy this class, and this wouldn't really make sense, but let's just give it a go. And instead of wrap here, I had another header component class. This test is now going to fail because we're expecting only to have 1 div with this class, but we're actually finding 2. So let's come back over to our test, or rather our component. Let's reset that back to rep, and that is now going to pass. Our test is now passing. So we can also remove that console log as we don't need that. And that's looking pretty good. But there's one thing that we haven't done, and that's written this separate test to test that our component is successfully rendering a logo. So again, under this test, we're going to write another one, and we're just going to say that it should. In fact, we don't really need to say it here. I think we should just start that off by saying should. And here we're going to say should render a logo. And again, we'll pass a function. And we can kind of just copy paste this code here. But I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to take this class here, which was logo image. So this time we're looking for logo image. And here I'm just going to call this my logo. So all we're doing here is we're doing a shallow render of the component. We're then doing, we're then finding the logo, and if that is returning true, then the test passes. So again, we now have 2 tests within our header component. First one being that we should render without errors, and the second one being that we should render a logo. Now, technically, these tests are passing, and there really isn't anything wrong with them. But I think there's definitely areas for improvement. I think we can refactor this and make it a little bit better, because currently, if we look at the first 2 lines, they're pretty much the same, right? We're just doing a shallow render of our header component. So I think that's the first thing we should try and figure out, because as our tests grow, and especially working on larger projects, we're going to have a lot more tests, and we definitely don't want any repetitive code. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a setup function. Okay, so I'm going to say setup, and I am going to pass some default props. If there isn't any, we're just going to pass an empty object. And basically what I want to do is just shallow render the component, right? So I'm just going to do const component equals the shallow render, pass in the header here. And in the instance where we want to actually pass some kind of props here, it's going to pass those. And then we're just going to do a return and return the component. So what we want to do now is effectively run this function rather than running this header, right? This shallow render. So we can actually do setup and run that here, and also we can just do setup. And of course, this is a pretty good refactor because we have one function up here at the top, and this is just called for each one of our tests. So this is still passing, but I still think we can improve this a little bit more. So one thing that we can also do is we can declare this component variable here. And then we can do a before each. Okay, so in the before each, we're going to grab hold of this component, and we are going to do a run that setup function, right? And what that allows us to do is rather than actually, we can just get rid of this entire line from our tests, and our tests are still passing. So you may now be wondering exactly what I've done here. So what I've basically done is I've said, let's remove the shallow render from each one of our tests individually. I've created a function up here where we're just returning the shallow render. You can ignore the fact that we've given this the same name. This is a constant. It just lives inside of the scope of the setup function. We're just literally returning the shallow render of the header component every time that this function runs. We're then running a before each. Now this before each is basically run before every single test. So basically here we're declaring a component let variable, and basically we're then grabbing that before each test. We're passing it the value of the setup function, which is a shallow render, and then we have access to that to use it immediately in each one of our tests. So we don't even have to declare the component inside of our tests. It already exists because we're running this before every single one of our tests. Now at this point, we've already made a pretty massive improvement to our tests with that last refactor. But there's one other thing that I want to show you guys. Now, when I actually do a shallow render, and we are going to do a find here, we're currently looking for a class name. Now, if we come over to our component, I want to give you an example. Let's say another developer comes along, they don't realize that this class name is used in one of our tests, and they change a class name from header component to header, and they save that test, that file. If I come over to my test is now breaking. Even though we know for a fact that the component is rendering without errors, it is going to fail because that class that it's looking for no longer exists. And this other developer has no idea because, to be fair, they didn't write this code originally. They don't realize, they have no way of knowing that that is an important class name for our test. So that is one reason why I think that using class names in tests is not the best idea. What I much prefer to do, and what I tell other people to do, is use a custom data test attribute. Now this is just going to contain the same value as what we would have used in the class. So we can remove this class name here, and we can just apply that as a data test attribute. We can also apply this same value on the logo. So I'm going to change this from class name to data test. And this is just going to be a way of us being able to tell other developers they must not change this value because it is used in a test, right? Let's have a peek at our tests, and they're obviously failing because these are still looking for the class name. So we need to do a bit of a refactor on our tests. At the moment, it's looking for this class name. This is now a data test attribute. So we need to basically remove this code, and I'm going to use some backticks. I'm going to enter an array. It is data test, and then I am going to enter the name of this attribute, the value, And I'm also going to replicate that for the logo test. So again, an array should be looking for data test, and this is the value. Oh, sorry, it's not. It's let's just check what that is. Logo img, logo image. Let's save that. Let's come back over to our tests, and our tests are now passing. So it is now using a data test attribute. Now, funny enough, this is actually also quite repetitive. This code here is now quite repetitive. So let's actually refactor this. Let's create another function. It's going to be find by data, test attribute. It's going to equal a function, and that function will accept two arguments. The first one being the component. The second one will be the attribute itself. And then what we want to do is actually grab hold of the component. We'll say wrapper equals component dot find. We're going to use two backticks here, an array, data test, and then in here we're going to insert that attribute, and then we will simply return the value of the wrapper constant. So that's looking pretty good. So let's grab hold of this new function, and down here where we're creating this wrapper, I'm just going to insert this function. We're going to posit the component, and then I'm going to posit this custom attribute, which we already know is header component, and we can save that. Now if I come over to terminal, the test is still passing, so we know that that is working. Let's apply this same code to our other component, our other test, sorry. So again, we're passing it our shallow render, which is stored in this component constant, and then the value here, which is logo img. Let's save that, and again our tests are passing. Now again, these are two big refactors, and they are really good improvements to our code. There's one other thing though, and this is kind of thinking ahead. We want to use particularly this find by test attribute in other test files, and I don't think we should be declaring this every single time we do a new test. So I want to create a utilities folder that's actually going to live outside of my source directory. I'm going to create that. I'm going to call it utils, and in here I'm going to just create a index file. Let's just call it index.js. And I'm going to come back over to my test file. I'm going to extract this function here, and I'm going to go into my utils folder, my file. And the difference here, we need to export it. So we're going to say export const, and we're just going to export that. And then I'm going to come back over to my test file, and rather than obviously this is now erroring because we're trying to use something that doesn't exist, I'm going to have to import that. So up here, I'm just going to import from that utils file. And I want to import that function. And again, now our tests are passing, and we can share this code across our various different tests. Now, you may notice that although I've created this setup function, this actually may vary it definitely will vary between test files. For example, we have different components in every test. In some, we may not have props, we may use state, etc. So it really is the best idea for us to keep this within our test file, as this may vary, but generally this is going to be fine going. But it definitely is a good idea for something like our find by test attribute function, because that is definitely something that is going to be the same throughout our tests. Okay, so we've successfully written our first tests As you can see, they are passing. I think this would be a good time for us to make another commit. So I'm going to do another git status. And when we do, you can see that these are the modified and added files. So I'm going to do another git add. And then I'm going to do a commit. So git commit. And I'm just going to say this is our header component and tests. Okay, so if I do another git status, you'll see that we're working on that there's nothing there to commit. Now let's come back over to our mockup, and we have created our header component, but I did mention before that we also want another component for our kind of headline here. It should be like a page heading with a H1 and a mini description for the page. Now our header component is a functional component, and the difference between a class and a functional component is the ability to use lifecycle methods. Things like component did mount or will unmount, etc. Now in the world of React, things are changing. If you look at the latest stable release of React, which I believe is React 16.7, there are some new introductions such as hooks and various things that enable us to do a lot more with functional components. But the real aim of this tutorial is to explain to you how to write tests for different types of components. We are focusing on testing components in this specific tutorial. Now there are various different types of components. There are functional components, there are classes, there are also connected components. These are components that are connected to the store, the Redux store. However, in this video, I want to also show you how to test a class. So even though we may not need our header component, which is going to basically be this portion of our page, we may not need it to be a class. I am going to write it as a class because I think I want to show you guys how you write your tests for classes. And really it is the same, but I think it would be useful for me to show you that separately. So let's go ahead and create a new component in our components folder. I'm going to call this headline. And inside of this, I'm going to create another file. I'm just going to call it again index.js. Let's go ahead and create another file for spec.js, and let's actually create another one for styles, or styles.scss. Inside of our headline component, we're going to import React from React. I'm also actually going to destructure component from that as well. Then we can just create a class. I'm going to call this my headline component. So that is going to extend component. We need a render method, and in there we're going to return some basic JSX. We're going to come back to that. And then we'll just do an export default headline. And let's just, for now, let's just put in, test or something so I can see that it renders correctly. Let's go through into our app.js, and we need to import that component. So I'm going to say import headline from, and go into our components folder, headline. And I'm actually going to create a div here. It can be a HTML5 section. And I'm just going to give this a class name of main or something. And inside of here is actually where I'm going to include my headline. And if I actually come over to our web page, you'll see there's our test. Now, I wanted to add this wrapper, this section wrapper of main, because I want to apply some basic margins. So in app.scss, I'm going to add in another class here. And I'm going to apply that same width. So I'm going to give it 100% width. I'm going to margin. I'm actually going to put 100 or maybe like 50 pixels from the top. I'm going to center it, and then maybe like another 80 from the bottom. It's going to have a padding definitely of 10 pixels left and right. And I want to add in that max width here of 980 pixels. just to center that. So this is what we've got. I might actually reduce that top margin of like, I don't know, to maybe 20 pixels. I think that would be better. The other thing that I want to flag here is I really don't like the font. I don't want to get too much into styling, but I do want to add some basic styling here. So I'm going to come over to Google Fonts. This is our free fonts for us from Google. I'm going to grab hold of actually Open Sans. Open Sans I like a little better, so I'll get rid of Roberto. Let's customize that. I'm just going to get regular and bold probably. That looks good. And we can then grab that import, so we can just grab hold of this. I'm going to come over to public index.html and just include this import somewhere in my header. That will be fine. Come back over here. If I come over to Google, it's just going to give me this font family. I'll grab hold of that, and on my body I'll apply that font family with a font size something like maybe 18 pixels, a line height of 22, and you know, color wise I think it's fine to give it probably the same as our header, 12 12 12. Looks good. Let's come back over, and you can see we've now applied that font. Just a little bit nicer. I didn't like that default font before. It was kind of bothering me. So cool. So we've now got our headline component. We've also got kind of a body, a container centered on the page as well. So that looks good. So I'm going to come back over to, let's actually close everything here. Let's open what we need. And let's go over to our headline. It's going to be pretty simple here. I'm actually just going to have a H1. And I'm actually going to pass this through props. Okay, so we're going to actually declare this. So I'm going to have a constructor pass props here. We're going to have a super. Again, we're going to have props. Okay, so now we're ready to do this. So let's destructure from our props. So const equals this dot props. And I'm going to destructure header and a description from props. I'm going to insert them as a H1 for the header. And also probably render the description in a paragraph tag, so something like this. But if we do not have a header, I'm going to return null. Okay, so it's pretty simple at the moment, but let's actually come over to our app.js. Cool. So for the headline, I'm going to pass two props, as you know. First one being a header. This is going to be posts. And then I am also going to have a description. And again, this is going to be something like click the button to render posts. Okay, let's do that. And now you can see that we are successfully rendering those out on the page. So now that we've done that, we're pretty much ready to write our first tests for this headline component. So let's come back over to our headlines spec file, and I'm going to go ahead and import React from React. And again, we want to import, well, actually we want to destructure from Enzyme shallow. And then again, finally, we want to import our headline component itself. Now, the other thing is that we already know we have this utility function. So again, I'm going to import that as I know I'm going to need it. That is outside of the source folder in the utilities folder, and it is called find by test attribute. Great, so we're ready to write our first tests. Now there are a few differences here. So if we actually look at the file itself, we are currently rendering null if we do not have props passed to our component. So really we need to test both states. So in our spec.js, I'm going to have a describe function here, and we're going to just name the overall tests as the headline component, and we'll pass a function here. And then we need to actually test both circumstances. So I'm going to have another describe function. As I mentioned before, we can have multiple nested describe functions, and this is where we have props, and then another describe function, have no props, and here we'll pass another function. Now inside here we actually want to use our setup function, which we have not created yet, so I'll create that up here at the top. So setup, and that's going to equal a function, and again we're going to be passing props, and if there are none, then we're going to pass an empty object. So we need to create another constant for our component that is going to equal a shallow render of the component itself. And again, we are going to pass those props. So I'm going to use the spread operator, and then I'm going to simply return the shallow render itself. And then within our describe function where we have props, I'm going to use a before each. And this is why we have two nested describe functions, because this is the part that is going to be different. So again, we are going to parse a function here. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do here is actually create those props. So I'm going to say const props equals an object, and this props object is going to contain the props that is actually required. So we need a header and description. So I'll just create a header string, which is going to be I don't know, test header, and then a description. It's going to be some test description. So when we actually use our setup function, and again we need to actually have a let wrapper here, and then over here we can use that. So we'll say wrapper equals setup, our setup function, and we'll pass props to that setup function. And that's going to be the difference here, because when we actually create our before each function here, we'll pass a function, but when we actually declare the value of our wrapper, we will say wrapper equals our setup function, but we're not passing any props to that. Okay, cool. So now that we actually have it, we can write our first test. So this is where we actually have props. So we should render something. I'm actually going to come over to our index.js, and again, this is our headline component. So I'm going to have another data test attribute here, and I'm going to call this my headline component. We should again have a header, h1. So I'm going to have a data test. This is my header, and again we need another data test to target our description. So let's come back over to our test, and we need to write another test. So the first test is that it should render without errors as the very first thing that we want to check. So again, all we'll need to do is use our const component equals find by test attribute. We'll posit the wrapper, and then the data test attribute we're looking for, and we want to expect the component returns with a length to be 1. Now that obviously contains our first test, and as you can see, our headline component, it is actually if I just expand this, you can see that this is basically showing that it is rendering without errors. That is successfully parsing. Now if I was again to come over to our component and I change the value, you're going to see that this is now failing, and obviously it is expecting 1 and received 0. So it is now, that is working. We also want to check that it should render a H1. So we want to check that. So again, we're going to check for a const of H1 is find by data test attribute. We'll posit the wrapper, and it should have a value of header. So that is the attribute we're looking for. And we want to again expect that the H1 length to be 1, and again that is now parsing. And again it should render, so again it should render a description. So again, const description equals find by test attribute. We'll posit the wrapper, and again we'll expect that the description returns with a length to be 1. And again, if I come back over now, we have all of those, they are working. Great. So that is in the scenario where we have props, but we also want to test where we do not. So we want to check that, first of all, that it should not render. So again, we'll pass a function here, and what we want to check for is the component. So const component equals find by test attribute. We'll posit the wrapper, and again very similar to what we did here, in fact almost exactly the same, but what we want to check for is that rather it be 1, it should return with 0. And as you can see, have no props, should not render, and that is also parsing. Now what you might be wondering here is that it's not showing the tests for our header component, and that is because it is we have already committed those changes. So by default, if we're using Git and we have committed some of our changes, it is only going to by default show us the tests relevant to those that have changed since the last commit. So if I want to see all of them, I can watch usage. I can click on W and then A, and that runs all the tests. So it's run all the tests for header. So in total, we have six tests in total, and all of them are passing. At this point, we are now ready to actually go ahead and commit our changes. So let's do another git status, and let's do a git add all, and we can then commit that with another message, headline component with tests, and then do another git status, and you can see that we are working on a clean version of our branch. So we're now ready to push that to our remote Git repository. So again, I'll do another git status. We'll get the name of the branch we created at the start of this tutorial. I'm going to do a git push into origin, and that click on return, and that's going to push up our work. And that brings us to the end of this video tutorial where I showed you how to test your React components. In the next video, we will be working with prop types, and I'm going to show you how you can test your prop types within your components. Again, I've already pushed the code from this tutorial to our official repository on GitHub. You can find that by visiting us on github.com/simpletut and finding the repository or the direct link that is in the description of this video. Again, all the videos from this series will be posted into our official playlist that will be added to our YouTube channel. You can also find that by either searching our channel and our playlists or the direct link that I will also place in the description to this playlist. But I'd also like to ask you to visit our official Facebook page, facebook.com/simpletut, and like us. This is a great way for you to keep in touch with us as we release new content, and indeed as we release new videos in this and other series. I'd also like to encourage you to visit our repository, fork, and watch this repository for changes as we release new videos. As I said, we will be posting the code at the end of each tutorial. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next video.